He slammed his last $90 on the auction table, then bought a container no one wanted. Inside wasn't trash, it was a coffin of secrets. When he tore through the rusted wall, the air turned colder. A letter fell out, stained, trembling, whispering, "If you found this, I'm already dead." His name was Jonas Hale, 46, a homeless veteran with a service patch half torn from his jacket and a German shepherd who wouldn't stop digging at ghosts. Once, he'd saved men under fire. Now, no one remembered his name. People passed him like fog. No one cared who he'd been or what he'd lost. Until that night, when his dog scratched open the wall and history clawed its way out. A secret buried 30 years ago. A murder disguised as an accident. And a man who swore he'd never fight again, forced to pick up the truth. Because sometimes justice doesn't knock, it scratches. Before we begin, hit like, share, and subscribe. Tell me, where in the world are you hearing this story tonight? The morning fog over Pier 17 hung low and heavy, swallowing sound and shape until only fragments of the world remained. The groan of cranes, the metallic clang of a buoy, the thin cry of gulls circling for scraps. The air was sharp with salt and iron, the kind of cold that didn't just touch skin, it remembered it. A few dockhands stood hunched over their coffee, their breath ghosting upward, watching the auction unfold with the same dull interest one might give the tide. Jonas Hale stood apart from them. The sea wind pulled at his coat, olive green, frayed at the seams, a faded military patch stitched above the heart. His fingers, raw from winter, turned the bills in his hand again and again as if the warmth of friction might make them multiply. $90. All he had left. He stared at it the way a drowning man stares at the last breath in his lungs. The auctioneer's voice cut through the air, flat and mechanical, amplified through a cheap speaker that made every word rattle. Unit 49C, abandoned 6 months, starting at 50. His gloved hand waved lazily toward a dented metal container the color of rusted blood. No one moved. The silence stretched, brittle and expectant. Jonas felt something stir, something between desperation and defiance. His hand rose before his mind could stop it. 90, he said, the word slipping out like confession. The auctioneer glanced over, squinting, then shrugged. Sold. The gavel's crack was swallowed by the wind. The crowd drifted away, and Jonas was left standing alone before the container that now belonged to him. It loomed like a tomb at the edge of the pier, streaked with salt, its hinges frozen with time. When he broke the lock with an old crowbar, the sound screamed through the cold morning air. The door creaked open, slow as a breath after drowning. The smell hit him first, mold, oil, old rope, salt, and something faintly sweet like decay. The kind of scent that made the past seem alive again, but only just. He stepped inside. His boots sank into dust and shredded cardboard. A broken chair leaned against the wall, a rusted bicycle frame, a torn tarp that had once been blue. A dead man's past, he muttered, though no one heard. A veteran's future. He sat in the doorway, half in shadow, half in light. The sea behind him was gray and endless. Bear, his 6-year-old German shepherd, padded closer, tail low, breath steaming. The dog lay beside him without a sound, the heavy fur on his neck rising with each exhale. Jonas reached down and brushed a hand over his head. The warmth under his fingers was the only proof that something in this world still lived. The pier stretched silent around them. Far off, a ship's horn moaned, a sound like sorrow learning how to speak. Jonas's gaze drifted to the horizon, but there was no horizon anymore, only fog and memory blending into each other. He remembered nights in the desert, the burnt scent of sand after rain, the faces of men he couldn't save. He remembered coming home to a country that had already moved on, people who spoke of sacrifice with pride but turned away when the sacrifice showed up hungry. He looked at his hands, scarred, shaking, the nails blackened at the edges. Once they had carried men out of fire. Now they held nothing. His stomach tightened. He hadn't eaten since the day before. There was a stale granola bar in his pocket. He broke it in half, handed one piece to Bear, who took it gently. The rest he chewed slowly, tasting metal and regret. The sun never truly rose that day. It just pressed through the fog like an old photograph fading into view. Jonas leaned back against the doorframe, eyes half closed, letting the cold seep in. He thought of how strange it was, how men could fight wars for honor, but lose themselves for nothing. Bear stirred. The sound was small, but it carried in the stillness. The dog's ears pricked forward, his nose twitching toward the back wall of the container. Jonas barely noticed at first. Then came the scratching, soft, rhythmic, deliberate. Bear's paws worked against the metal as if answering a call only he could hear. Jonas frowned. "Hey," he said softly. But Bear didn't stop. The dog's body stiffened, tail straight, breath quickening. Something in that stance, alert, certain, unyielding, pulled Jonas to his feet. He took the flashlight from his pocket and stepped closer. The beam slid across the wall, catching on streaks of rust and shadows. Then it stopped. Perfectly straight lines ran from floor to ceiling. Two vertical seams so precise they didn't belong to chance. He pressed his palm against the surface. The metal was colder there and hollow when tapped. A memory flashed. Afghanistan, an abandoned bunker, a false wall hiding a weapons cache. The same cold echo, the same silence afterward. Jonas drew in a slow breath. "That's not a wall," he murmured. His heartbeat quickened. The flashlight trembled in his grip. He crouched, tracing the seam with his fingers, following it down to the floor where grime had settled thick. He pushed a shoulder against it, testing. It didn't move. He tried again. The hollow thud came back at him like an answer from the dark. Bear shifted behind him, whining low. The sound caught somewhere between fear and instinct. Jonas turned his head slightly, meeting those amber eyes glowing faint in the beam. "You feel it too, don't you?" The dog didn't move. Only his breath came faster, fogging the air between them. Outside, a gust of wind slammed against the container. The sound deep and booming, like something enormous waking from sleep. The walls vibrated. A loose chain clinked against the frame. Jonas stood there, caught between reason and that strange pull in his chest. He'd come here looking for a place to store the remains of his life. Old gear, a cot, maybe a chance to disappear. Instead, he had found a wall that breathed. He thought of leaving, walking away before curiosity turned into trouble. But the truth was, he had nowhere left to go. The world outside this container had already shut its doors. Maybe whatever waited behind this one would at least make sense of why he was still here. He pressed his ear to the metal. At first, nothing. Then, faint, almost imagined, a distant clang, like a loose chain dragged across iron. His blood ran cold. Bear barked once, sharp and low. Jonas stepped back, eyes fixed on the wall. The flashlight beam quivered, gliding over the seams once more. The air seemed heavier now, the smell of oil stronger, the silence louder. Somewhere deep inside that wall, something waited, something that had been hidden, forgotten, and refused to stay buried any longer. The wind howled through the pier, scattering paper, salt, and echoes. Jonas exhaled, the sound thin and fragile. He tightened his grip on the flashlight. "Guess this is it, buddy," he whispered. "The end of the line." But Bear's gaze said otherwise. And when the next gust came, rattling the container and stirring the chains again, Jonas knew he wasn't standing at the end of anything. He was standing at the edge of something vast, something that would drag him backward through time and force him to face everything he had tried to forget. The clang sounded again, clearer this time, ringing like a heartbeat trapped in metal. Then silence. And that was how it began. On a forgotten pier, with $90, a rusted lock, and a dog who refused to stop scratching at ghosts. The sound came first, the faint echo of metal surrendering to metal. Then silence, so pure it seemed to breathe. Jonas steadied his hands, the crowbar wedged tight into the seam. Rust crumbled under the strain, falling in dull flakes against his boots. One last pull, a grunt, and the false panel gave way with a long, weary groan. The sound rolled through the container like something old being woken from its grave. A rush of stale air escaped, thick and heavy, tasting of iron and years forgotten. Dust rose, swirling in the narrow beam of his flashlight, turning the small space into a galaxy of ghostly particles, each one a remnant of whoever had sealed this place shut. Jonas leaned closer, blinking against the haze. Inside the hollow was a small void, no bigger than a coffin, lined with metal ribs that glistened faintly under the light. The air inside felt colder, as though time itself had stopped breathing. He hesitated before reaching in. His fingers brushed against wood, smooth, dry, fragile. Then another texture, heavier, metallic, coated in a thin film of dust. He dragged them out one by one. A wooden box with carvings so faint they might have been fingerprints. An envelope sealed with brittle red wax, and a black military case that looked like it had survived a war of its own. 3 objects. 3 stories, all waiting in the dark for someone desperate enough to listen. Bear shifted behind him, the soft tap of claws on metal echoing through the container. The dog's breath came slow, his head tilted, eyes fixed on the opened void as if watching a wound reopen. Jonas could feel it too, that strange pressure in the air when the past presses too close to the present. He knelt on the cold floor, the wooden box resting on his knee, the envelope trembling slightly in his grip. The seal cracked under his thumb, dry as ash. The paper inside was yellowed, creased, edges torn where time had eaten away the corners. His flashlight trembled as he unfolded it, the light spilling across the uneven script written in faded blue ink. Each letter wavered, ghostly against the paper, like a voice whispering through fog. "My name is Henry Lawson. If you are reading this, I am dead. What you hold is the truth about my brother's murder." Jonas's breath caught. The words were blunt, stripped of hope, written by a man who knew he would never be believed. The letter continued, ink blotched, trembling lines speaking of a secret buried for decades, of guilt that rotted deeper than bone. Jonas could almost hear Henry Lawson's voice in his ear, low and shaking, the kind of voice that speaks only when there's no one left to save. His eyes blurred for a moment, and suddenly he was somewhere else. Not in a cold container on Pier 17, but back in a desert where everything burned. The sky was white and cruel, the ground trembling beneath the roar of engines. Diesel and blood mixed in the air. He saw himself younger, stronger, sunburned, and sure. He heard the voice of his commanding officer barking through static, "We don't report this. It's operator error." He remembered the scream, the one that didn't stop when the explosion did. A man pinned beneath a machine that should never have failed. Jonas had fought to lift it, bare hands on burning metal, the smell of cooked sand and flesh filling his lungs. When it was over, he'd watch them file the report, watch the ink dry over the truth. He'd signed it too, because he was told to, because survival had a chain of command. Now, decades later, under the buzzing light of a pier warehouse, he could still feel that pen in his hand. The weight of it. The silence afterward. He thought he'd buried it with the rest of the dead. But the letter in his palm was proof that lies had long roots, and some grew right through the soil of time. Bear pressed closer, his head resting against Jonas's shoulder, the steady warmth grounding him back to the present. The dog's fur was damp from the salt air, and when Jonas touched him, it was like touching something real again after drifting too long in memory. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his pocket as though afraid it might vanish. He turned to the black case next. The thing looked indestructible. Steel edges dented, hinges scarred, 3 locks corroded shut. Each lock bore faint military markings, the kind no civilian equipment ever had. He tapped one with his finger. The hollow ring echoed inside the container like a heartbeat. Whatever was inside had been meant to stay hidden. He looked at the wooden box again. Small, carved with a faint emblem he couldn't quite read. He lifted the lid and found old photographs bound by a leather strap. Faces stared back, men in uniform, a woman smiling beside a river, a little girl holding a model airplane. The ink had bled, but the emotion hadn't. They were ghosts frozen mid-laughter, and for a moment, Jonas felt like he'd intruded on someone else's heaven. Outside, the wind changed. The sea hit the pier in slow, rhythmic waves, and the distant hum of a generator pulsed through the stillness. Jonas leaned back against the wall, the objects spread before him like relics on an altar. He stared at them, at the evidence of a man's final confession, and thought about how the world measures truth, how often it gets buried beneath convenience, beneath signatures, beneath men in suits who will never smell diesel or ash. Different men, different century, same corruption. His mouth tightened. The words from the letter seemed to vibrate through his bones. If you're reading this, I am dead. But maybe the real death was the silence that followed, the years where no one asked why. He looked down at his hands again, remembering how they'd once obeyed orders, how they'd once turned away. Maybe that was the first betrayal. Bear exhaled sharply, breaking the quiet. Jonas looked at him and managed a faint smile, tired and wry. Maybe this time, he murmured, the words barely sound. We don't walk away. He sat there for a while longer, letting the meaning of it settle, the way a wound stops bleeding but keeps aching. The container felt smaller now, the walls bending inward, filled with air too heavy to breathe. Somewhere outside, a seagull screamed, the sound sharp enough to make him flinch. Jonas rose slowly, bones stiff from cold and memory. He gathered the items, the letter, the photographs, the sealed case, and placed them back into the hollow behind the wall. Not to hide them, but to buy himself time to think. He would return. He had to. There was purpose in his hands again, and it frightened him almost as much as it steadied him. As he reached for the flashlight, a faint flicker crossed the far wall of the container. Light from outside, sharp and stuttering, bleeding through the small vent near the roof. He turned toward it instinctively. Beyond the vent, across the pier, a security light blinked on and off. Steady, then broken, then steady again. He narrowed his eyes. For a moment, he thought it was just the wind. But then he saw it, a shadow moving against the glare. Slow, measured, watching. The beam from his flashlight trembled slightly, slipping off the wall and catching the glint of the black case. Jonas stood motionless, heart steady but mind racing. He'd seen enough of life to know when he was being observed. Somewhere out there, beyond the rusted walls of Unit 49C, someone else knew what was hidden here. He didn't know yet who they were, or whether they wanted the truth buried deeper or dug all the way up. But he knew one thing for certain. He'd already opened the door. There was no closing it again. The flicker of the light steadied once more. Then it went dark. The wind filled the silence, cold and endless. Bear shifted closer, pressing against Jonas's leg, eyes fixed on the vent. And somewhere, under the hum of the pier and the whisper of the waves, something unseen watched back. The morning light came slow and tired, as though it too had spent the night awake. Mist clung to the docks like a memory refusing to let go. Jonas sat on the curb outside a small diner, his elbows on his knees, the letter unfolded between his hands. The ink had faded almost to gray, but he read it again as if the words might change, as if one line might suddenly make the past make sense. Bear lay curled under the chair, his fur damp with sea air, his eyes half closed but alert in that way dogs never truly sleep. A waitress stepped outside to shake out a rug, gave Jonas a look that lingered on his torn coat, and moved on without a word. Inside the diner, someone turned up the radio. The announcer's voice drifted out, a cheerful tone listing the rising stocks of Bishop Corporation. Jonas glanced at the paper beside him. A full-page advertisement gleamed in black ink. Bishop Industries, building tomorrow's America. Below it, the face of Calvin Bishop smiled like a man whose conscience had been surgically removed. Jonas folded the letter again, slipping it into his coat. His jaw tightened. He had spent half the night searching names in the public library's old archive terminal, the kind with keys that stuck and a fan that hummed like a distant engine. It was there he'd found it, a headline buried in a local section dated 15 years earlier. Community activist challenges Bishop Corporation. Under the bold print was a photo of a woman standing at a microphone, eyes fierce, jaw set, a winter coat buttoned high around her neck. Clara Lawson, the daughter of the man the letter said had been murdered. He read the short article twice, tracing her name with his finger as though to anchor himself to something still living. 30 years had passed since Ethan Lawson's death, and here was his child still fighting the same name that had buried her father. Jonas pushed the cold coffee aside, whistled softly to Bear, and stood. "Come on, buddy," he murmured. The dog stretched, shaking off the chill, and together they walked toward the bus stop. The ride uptown was long and uneven. Gray buildings rose higher as the ocean smell faded into exhaust and asphalt. Jonas sat near the back, the letter inside his coat like a heartbeat. Across the aisle, a mother rocked her child, the soft hum of her lullaby rising and falling with the sway of the bus. He turned his gaze to the window, where his reflection stared back, lined, unshaven, a man halfway between nowhere and purpose. The city outside blurred past, alive in ways he no longer knew how to be. By the time he reached the community center, afternoon light had turned the windows to pale amber. He paused at the entrance, watching through the glass. Inside, rows of chairs faced a makeshift stage. People gathered, young and old, bundled in coats, their faces drawn but listening. On the stage stood Clara Lawson. She was in her mid-30s, tall, her hair the color of autumn bark, loosely tied. At the back, a simple gray coat framed her shoulders. Her hands moved as she spoke, not for flourish but to keep from trembling. Her voice carried with the rhythm of conviction worn by exhaustion. She spoke of clean water, of land bought and poisoned, of names too powerful to question. Behind her, a projector flickered grainy photos of polluted rivers and dead fish glistening in the sun. Jonas stood in the doorway, unseen, listening. He had heard many kinds of speeches in his life. Rallies, briefings, confessions, but this one moved differently. Each word she spoke seemed to come from a place below pride, a place where loss and purpose became the same thing. For a moment, he saw her father in her, the man from the photograph in the wooden box, laughing with a little girl on his knee. When the meeting ended, the crowd broke into clusters, some shaking her hand, some arguing, most simply slipping back into the noise of the city. Clara thanked them quietly, collected her notes, and stepped outside into the cold. The street lamps had begun to hum, halos of light trembling in the fog. She exhaled, breath silver in the air, and closed her eyes for a second, just long enough for fatigue to show through the armor. Jonas approached slowly, Bear padding beside him, paws silent on the wet pavement. He stopped a few feet away. The street between them was narrow, but filled with decades. He reached into his coat and drew out a photograph, creased, smoke-stained, the edges curled. A man in military green smiling with pride, holding a laughing child with pigtails. He extended it toward her without a word. Clara hesitated, confusion flickering before recognition struck. Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. Her fingers touched the edge of the photo as though afraid it might burn her. "My father," she breathed. The words cracked. That photo burned in the fire. Jonas's voice was low, rough as gravel. Not everything burned. Silence held for a moment, heavy but not empty. She looked at him then, not at the coat or the scars or the dog, but straight into the weary steadiness behind his eyes. Whatever she saw there made her hand tighten around the photograph instead of letting it fall. A car passed, splashing through a puddle. Somewhere down the block a siren wailed and faded. The world moved on, but they stood still. Two survivors of different wars meeting in the quiet between. She looked down at Bear, who sat calmly, tail thumping once against the ground. "He's beautiful," she said softly, almost as if to fill the space between questions. Jonas nodded. "He finds what's hidden," he said, "always has." Clara glanced back at the community center where the lights were dimming. Her expression shifted, the weight of curiosity mixing with something like fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words never came. Across the street, a sound interrupted, the low idle of an engine. A black SUV sat, half in shadow, its headlights off but engine running, exhaust curling into the cold air. Jonas's gaze sharpened. Through the windshield he caught the faint silhouette of a man behind the wheel, motionless except for one hand that lifted slowly. A phone glimmered. The tiny flash of a camera lens flicked once, then again. Clara noticed it too. "Do you know him?" she whispered. Jonas didn't answer. The SUV lingered a heartbeat longer, then rolled away into the fog, taillights disappearing like embers dying in water. For a while, neither of them spoke. The city resumed its rhythm around them. The shuffle of shoes, the hiss of a passing bus, the echo of doors closing. Clara folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket, as though placing it near her heart might keep it safe. She looked up, her voice steadier now but carrying something fragile beneath. "Why did you bring this to me?" Jonas met her gaze, and though he said nothing, the answer lived in the stillness between them. "Because the dead deserve witnesses. Because silence is the most dangerous lie." A gust of wind swept down the street, tugging at her hair and the corner of his coat. Somewhere above them, a neon sign flickered and buzzed, painting their faces in intermittent light. It made her look for a moment like a child again. The little girl from the photograph, caught between laughter and fear. Jonas adjusted his collar, eyes scanning the now empty street. The dog shifted, restless. He could feel the night turning. "Be careful, Miss Lawson," he said finally. His voice carried the weight of someone who knew what warnings cost when ignored. Clara nodded once, slowly. "You too." They parted without ceremony. She back toward the warmth of the center, he down the street toward the dark. But as Jonas walked, he could feel the photograph's memory in the air, following him like smoke. Somewhere behind him, the black SUV turned a corner. The sound of its tires was almost lost to the wind. The warehouse near the river had long been forgotten by everyone except the wind. It crouched beneath the highway bridge, its windows broken, its walls tattooed with rust and silence. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood, motor oil, and something old enough to have lost its name. A single light bulb swung from the ceiling, its glow flickering with every gust that slipped through the cracked roof. Jonas stood beside an iron table, the black military case resting on it like a relic exhumed from another life. The metal was so cold it fogged under the breath that escaped his lips. Clara stood opposite him, her coat pulled tight, arms crossed as though to steady the tremor she couldn't quite hide. The sound of the river outside was constant, a slow, heavy breathing through the night. Bear paced near the door, nails clicking softly on the concrete, tail stiff, body alert. The kind of silence that follows fear had settled between them. Jonas exhaled, his breath white in the dim air. "There's something in here that killed your father," he said quietly. His fingers brushed the surface of the case, tracing its dents and old serial numbers. Clara didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on it, as if it might open by will alone. Then Bear froze. His ears pricked, head turning toward the far corner where the wall met the darkness. The growl began low, rumbling through his chest like a warning from deep in the earth. Jonas's shoulders stiffened. He had learned to trust that sound long ago. It never lied. Outside, gravel shifted under boots. Slow, measured, deliberate. Jonas reached for the crowbar, leaning by the wall, its iron surface slick with rust. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door. Then came the whisper of fabric, a metallic click, the unmistakable rhythm of a safety being checked. The door opened. 2 men stepped through. They were well-fed, well-pressed, and entirely out of place. Their coats were too clean, shoes polished enough to catch the dim light, and their eyes, cold, unblinking, carried the kind of confidence born from orders that came with immunity. The taller one smiled without warmth. "Miss Lawson," he said, voice smooth as glass. "Mr. Bishop sends his regards. You're making life difficult." Clara took a half-step back, breath catching. Jonas moved forward, his presence enough to shift the air between them. He said nothing at first, only placed one hand on Bear's neck, the subtle weight of command. The dog stopped growling, but every muscle trembled with the urge to strike. "Walk away," Jonas said. His voice was soft, almost kind. The 2 men laughed, the sound hollow, echoing off the metal walls. The shorter one, a man with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, tilted his head. "You think you're the first to say that tonight?" he asked. His hand disappeared into his coat. That was enough. Bear moved before thought could form. A blur of gray fur and muscle, his snarl split the air like a storm breaking open. The taller man barely had time to shout before the dog collided with him, sending both crashing into a stack of rusted barrels. The clang rang out like gunfire. The second man reached for something in his jacket, but Jonas was already moving. The crowbar swung once, solid and sure. connecting with the metal doorframe beside the man's head. Not a strike, just a warning, but the sound was enough. The man stumbled back, panic overtaking purpose. "Call him off," he shouted, voice breaking. Jonas didn't move. "You first." The taller one hit the floor, winded, Bear's teeth at his sleeve, not yet breaking skin, but close. He froze, eyes wide with an animal kind of fear. The realization that this wasn't business anymore, it was survival. His partner grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the door. The two stumbled out into the fog, running, their footsteps fading into the sound of the river and the hum of passing trucks. Silence returned, thick and ringing. Jonas knelt beside Bear, hand finding the scruff of his neck. "Good boy," he whispered. The dog's breathing slowed, his eyes still fixed on the door. Outside, a gust swept through, carrying with it the smell of exhaust and rain. Clara stood unmoving, her back against the wall, the color drained from her face. She stared at the black case, half open from where Jonas had dropped it in the chaos. Her hands shook as she reached for it, hesitating only once before flipping the lid the rest of the way open. Inside, under a layer of yellowed cloth, lay a stack of ledgers bound in leather, pages marked by years of grease and ink. Beneath them, sealed folders stamped "Confidential, internal use only." And at the bottom, a single cassette tape. Its label, handwritten in faded ink, read, "Bishop Meeting, 1994. Jonas picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The plastic felt brittle, the magnetic strip glinting faintly under the hanging bulb, a relic from an age when truth still had to be recorded by hand. Clara's voice came out as a whisper. "That's the year my father died." Jonas met her eyes, the flicker of realization moving between them like lightning behind glass. "Then this," he said, "is what he died for." He placed the tape on the table beside the ledgers. The old cassette player he'd found in the storage box sat nearby, its casing cracked but intact. He set the tape inside, the sound of it clicking into place, sharp and final. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The bulb above them swayed gently, throwing their shadows long across the wall. Two figures caught between past and reckoning. Bear lay near the door, head on his paws, ears twitching at the distant sirens echoing from the highway. Jonas reached forward and pressed the button. The tape hissed, a soft static like the ocean in winter. Then, beneath it, a man's voice, calm, controlled, with the ease of someone used to being obeyed. "If this leaks," the voice said, pausing just long enough to let the words weigh themselves, "we all go down." The hiss deepened, swallowing the sound. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Jonas's eyes hardened, the reflection of the spinning reel turning in them like the slow rotation of a loaded chamber. Outside, the night held its breath. The wind moved through the cracks in the roof, whispering across the rusted beams as though even the ghosts were listening. And for the first time, the truth had a voice. Rain had been falling since dawn, soft and endless, turning the streets into mirrors of gray. Jonas drove through it with the wipers struggling to keep up, his knuckles white on the wheel. Beside him, Clara sat in silence, the black tape recorder balanced on her lap like something sacred and cursed. In the back seat, Bear lay with his head between his paws, the rhythmic sound of the rain echoing the slow pulse of tension inside the car. They turned down an old service road, the kind forgotten by city maps. The building that appeared through the mist looked like it had been abandoned decades ago, a one-story structure of brick and peeling paint. An American flag still clinging to its pole, though the colors had long bled away. This was where Clara said her ally lived. Jonas pulled up beside the cracked curb and killed the engine. the world went quiet except for the hiss of rain against the hood. When the door opened, the smell of coffee and gun oil drifted out. Agent Mac Riley stood in the doorway, older than Jonas remembered from newspaper clippings. 70, maybe older, shoulders broad but curved under the weight of too many years. His hair was steel gray, his face lined deep around the mouth and eyes, but there was still a sharpness there, the kind that doesn't retire even when the badge does. He wore a flannel shirt and suspenders, and the revolver on the table behind him said he never stopped looking over his shoulder. He looked at Clara first, recognition softening his expression. "You've got your father's eyes," he said quietly. Then to Jonas, "And you must be the one who woke the hornet's nest." They stepped inside. The small living room was lined with old case files, stacks of manila folders and cassette tapes labeled in faded ink. A single desk lamp threw a weak circle of light over a coffee-stained notebook. Jonas placed the black case on the table, opened it, and set the tape recorder beside it. For a moment, no one spoke. The rain ticked against the windows like fingers drumming for patience. Clara pressed play. The voice of Calvin Bishop filled the room, smooth, deliberate, the tone of a man who knew how power sounded. The leak was controlled. Lawson was stubborn, but accidents happen. The gas line was faulty. At least that's what the report says. Laughter followed. Then another voice, male, hesitant. "What about the inspector?" Bishop's reply came without pause. "He's been paid, they all have." When the tape ended, the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. Mac leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, jaw flexing. His hands were clasped tightly, the skin pale over the knuckles. "They buried your father," he said at last, voice low. "And they buried me too. I had this case once, before Bishop bought half the city and the rest of the bureau looked the other way." He reached for the tape, turning it over in his hand like a relic. Until now, Jonas watched him closely. There was something in Mac's eyes, a flicker between hope and vengeance, the same dangerous line soldiers walked after the war when justice became personal. Clara leaned forward, voice trembling but resolute. "We can still make it right. We release this. Show the world what he did." Mac nodded slowly. "Then we need proof that can't burn." The next hours blurred into motion. Papers spread across the table. Photocopies, faded ledgers, names of shell companies and bank accounts traced back to Bishop's empire. Jonas moved with a soldier's precision, sorting, scanning, cross-referencing. Clara drafted a statement by hand, words shaking as she wrote them, each letter a strike against fear. Bear dozed near the window, ears twitching whenever thunder rolled. Outside, the city slept uneasily beneath its blanket of rain. By midnight, the evidence sat in organized piles, the tape copied and secured. Mac leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "Tomorrow," he said, "we take this to the press. He won't see it coming." But evil rarely sleeps when truth starts moving. The fire began just past 1 a.m., a faint hiss in the wiring, the subtle scent of smoke curling through the vent. Jonas smelled it first. He turned toward the window and saw the orange bloom reflected on the glass. The next second, the alarms screamed. "Out!" he shouted. He grabbed Clara's arm as the ceiling above them cracked, raining down sparks. Smoke poured from the hallway, thick and fast. They stumbled through it, coughing, half blind, Bear barking ahead to guide them. Flames licked the wallpaper, feeding on the old files stacked along the walls. Jonas shielded Clara with his arm as a pane of glass shattered near them. The air seared his throat. He dragged her toward the exit, Bear limping beside them, his paw bleeding from a shard. Outside, the rain met the fire in bursts of steam, sirens wailing in the distance. They collapsed against the curb, both coughing, clothes soaked and singed. The building groaned behind them, each window glowing like an eye filled with rage. Mac stumbled out a moment later, clutching the melted remains of a tape reel, his face gray with ash and disbelief. "They knew," he rasped. "They knew exactly where to hit." Clara broke then. Her voice cracked, her body trembling as she pressed her face into Jonas's shoulder. "They'll kill us next," she said, "just like my father." Jonas held her close, his coat still wet from the rain, his voice steady even as his chest burned. "Then we make it count." The words hung there, heavy and certain, cutting through the chaos. Behind them, the flames devoured what was left of proof, memory, and years of silence. But something else had survived. The will to see it through. Later, at Mac's kitchen table, the three of them sat in darkness, the storm outside washing the night clean. The old agent's phone rang, its shrill tone breaking the stillness. He hesitated, exchanged a look with Jonas, then answered. A pause, then a voice on the other end, low, controlled, unmistakably deliberate. "He wants to meet," the caller said. "Tomorrow, Bishop himself." The line went dead. Mac set the phone down slowly, the weight of inevitability settling in his expression. Clara looked up, fear flickering behind her exhaustion. Jonas met her gaze, then reached down to scratch Bear's head. The dog's ears twitched, eyes on the door, as though he too understood what was coming. Outside, lightning split the clouds above the river, turning the city white for an instant, just long enough to reveal that the next chapter would be written not in ink but in reckoning. Morning broke clean and cold over the city, the kind of light that finds every window, every hidden corner, and leaves nothing untouched. The storm had passed. Streets glistened, washed bare of ash and smoke. Jonas stood in the lobby of a downtown office tower where everything was glass. Glass walls, glass tables, glass smiles. The air smelled of new carpet and disinfectant, the scent of money trying to disguise rot. Across the marble floor, Clara walked beside him, her steps steady but small, the faint tremor in her hands hidden behind a leather folder. Bear padded silently at their heels, the sound of his claws a quiet metronome of courage. The meeting room was high above the city, walled by sunlight and reflections. It was the kind of place built for men who believed in their own permanence. At the head of the table sat Calvin Bishop, silver-haired, immaculate, the kind of man who never seemed to sweat. His suit was charcoal, his tie perfectly knotted, his cufflinks gleaming like polished lies. When he smiled, it was the smile of a man rehearsed in victory. "Miss Lawson," he said smoothly, gesturing for them to sit. "Mr. Hale, I appreciate you coming. I'd hoped we could end this quietly." His tone was polite, almost tender, but the weight behind it was steel. He spoke of settlements, contracts, generous donations. He offered apologies that were perfectly phrased and perfectly meaningless. When words didn't soften them, he offered money. When money didn't work, he offered mercy. Clara sat across from him, her hands folded. She didn't blink. When he finished, she reached into her bag and drew out the recorder, the same one that had survived smoke, water, and betrayal. She placed it on the table between them. For a moment, no one moved. The city below shimmered in the glass walls around them, all light and illusion. Then, without a word, she pressed play. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable, smooth, confident, his own. "We fake the reports. He dies, I stay clean." The words hit like a slow thunder. The sound of truth, undeniable and unedited, broke through the glass perfection of the room. Bishop's hand twitched just once. His smile faltered, lips stiffening as if the mask he'd worn for decades had finally begun to crack. No one spoke. The lawyers seated behind him froze mid-breath. One of them reached for a pen that never touched paper. In the hallway outside, a door opened quietly, then another. Hidden cameras blinked red. Reporters stepped out from their cover, microphones raised, their lenses capturing the moment a giant began to fall. Bishop turned pale, his mouth opening in disbelief. "You," he began, but the rest never came. The voice on the tape kept talking, calm as confession. The lawyers stood in silence. Somewhere below, the city's pulse began to change. By sunset, Bishop's empire had cracked like ice underfoot. The headlines rolled in before he could even find a lawyer willing to return his call. Bishop Corporation exposed. Veteran and dog uncover 30-year cover-up. His portrait was torn down from boardrooms, his name erased from foundations that once bore it. Justice didn't come with a parade. It came with a quiet that felt like breathing again after too long underwater. Weeks passed. The city changed in small, imperceptible ways, a little more cautious, a little more awake. On the pier, the wind was softer now, less cruel. The storage unit where it had all begun still stood, its door open, no longer a wound but a window. Inside, there was nothing but sunlight and the faint scent of salt. Clara stood there one morning with a ribbon of white in her hand. Behind her, a new sign gleamed on the wall. The Hale Project, for veterans and families affected by corruption. She had built it from the ashes, piece by piece, her father's name stitched into every brick not as a monument to grief, but as a promise kept. Jonas stood at her side, the wind tugging at his coat, Bear resting at his feet. A small crowd gathered, volunteers, journalists, strangers who had followed the story and found themselves believing again. Someone handed Jonas the scissors, asked him to say a few words. He hated speeches. He always had. He cleared his throat, eyes sweeping the faces before him, all ordinary, all carrying their own quiet wars. The microphone caught his voice low and steady. "Some things you don't do for reward," he said. "You do them to remember who you are." It was simple, honest, and it was enough. The crowd applauded softly, some wiping their eyes, others smiling through the weight of what it meant. Bear barked once, sharp and joyful, his tail wagging as if to remind everyone that life, in the end, still chooses to go on. The laughter that followed broke the solemnity, a warmth spreading like sunlight across cold water. Clara looked up at Jonas then, the lines of exhaustion finally softening into peace. He didn't look back at her. He didn't need to. They both knew the story had never been about victory. It had been about survival, about truth, and the quiet redemption that comes when people who've been broken still choose to stand. As the ribbon fell and the cameras clicked, the sea breeze carried with it the faint hum of distant gulls and the whisper of a world still capable of healing. The sunlight reached across the dock, landing on Jonas's shoulder, on the dog at his side, and finally on the old military patch sewn to his jacket. Faded, frayed, but still holding. Bear lay down, head resting on Jonas's boots, the sound of the water lapping gently against the pier. And for the first time in decades, the man who had once walked among ghosts simply stood in the light, not haunted, not hunted, just home. Sometimes the world forgets its quiet heroes. They're not the ones who stand on stages or wear medals on their chests. They're the ones who stay behind after the noise fades, fixing what's broken, holding the line when no one's watching. Loyalty doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a whisper, a hand that doesn't let go, a promise kept when it would be easier to walk away. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stand firm in its shadow. And kindness, real kindness, it rarely asks to be seen. Maybe that's what keeps the world turning, the small, invisible acts that no headline will ever print. The men and women who mend, protect, forgive, the ones who carry light quietly, so others can find their way home. As the sun sets on another story, maybe it's enough to remember that goodness doesn't vanish. It just moves silently from one heart to another. And if you ever find yourself standing alone in the dark, listen closely. You might still hear the echo of a loyal heart, and know you were never truly alone.